Welcome everyone to our study of desire, why it matters, by Traleg Kyabgon and edited by Traleg Kyabgon. So as always, it's important when we're approaching, well, really anything, our motivation. But what really is interesting with what we're doing here, and in general with the path of enlightenment, is actually that we are getting to the bottom of what drives suffering. So we're not just doing a Buddhist thing or a thing about meditation or something about I want to realize myself or whatever. It's about understanding where the suffering in the world comes from and doing something about it. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't be politically active, environmentally active, and so forth. But at the same time, all these sort of various activities, while they are indeed essential and they should be done to ultimately get down to the bottom of what drives our suffering, we actually need to eliminate the core cause, which is the self. And what arises from the self is the grasping, the fixating, the desire. So that is why it matters. And if we, on the outset of our study here, keep this in mind, then also the attitude towards this study is much more powerful. And we should really bring with us this attitude that we're getting to the bottom of things. Recently, there was a friend of mine that was, she was sort of bemoaning how now that everybody has had an opportunity to retreat and to see the value of things when we're not rushing around the way we do in the ordinary, the way the world has slowed down in many respects. This is, of course, really just a perspective from a rather select portion of the world, but still, she was saying that it was as if nobody had learned anything from it. And of course, yes, but as long as that self and the object and the desire is still there, we're going to go right back into the patterns that we've had before. And this is something that plays out on a very worldwide scale and also on a minute scale. We're looking at it here in terms of the, you could say, microcosm that we experience in terms of our mind, but it's also something that's reflected externally. So the point being that as long as we don't get to the bottom of this, we are going to be perpetuating these habitual patterns. Okay. Someone's asking, have you started early? No, I actually started 30 seconds after 7:30. Anyway, yeah, I think we're not starting early. Anyway, remember there's the recording, huh? If ever you have to leave or if you can't be here on time and so on. Chapter 5, developing a liberated perspective. So habitually, as we were just talking about, our mind gravitates towards certain themes and patterns of thought. And this is, of course, what we humbly recognize in our engagement with the path of Dharma. And what we also need to understand is, as we are analyzing and familiarizing ourselves with what is going on in our mind, then we should understand that the mind, and this is habitual mind, we're not talking about the bodhicitta or the awakened mind, but the mind that sort of just turns along its own familiar patterns, it's stuck in the same rut. These patterns reinforced our confused sense of self. And once we have the sense of self, then we have the ensuing kleshas and karma. And what we mean by that is, once there's a sense of me, then there's the object, and then we pursue these objects. We have rigid ideas about the objects. We have rigid ideas about our world. And when we have that, then our actions become accordingly. Now, once our actions, and that means actions with body, with speech, and with mind, once we act on these impulses, these toxic impulses that we call kleshas, then we begin to put down patterns. And that's what then constructs us. This is then what begins to construct who we are. And that's what we call karma. There's nothing mystical about karma. It's just that we've sown particular seeds, we've plowed particular patterns and so on. And this is stored in terms of our confused sense of identity on what we call the all ground, or the alaya vijnana. What we're doing here doesn't necessarily need to entail something mystical. It's just that we begin to recognize these patterns just from knowing what's driving us. It's a very intimate knowledge, and it's not rocket science. It's not that difficult to recognize. And once we begin to recognize that, then of course, once we have some vision of what really makes us happy and what makes us miserable, then we can learn to relinquish fixation. This is what we're about here. And once we can do that, then this enables us to relinquish wrong view of affirmation and negation. And what we mean with that is that we begin to fixate in rigid ways on reality as being one way or another. We looked at this last time, but this is a really important theme because we kind of fail to see reality, we fail to relate to reality, we fail to live reality, we fail to have a life, if you like, because we're continually slotting reality into these labels and boxes of saying this is what there is or it's not there. Reality in itself doesn't really have any of these problems, affirmation and negation. There's no sense of existing, not existing, and so on. These are labels that we impute on phenomena. Traleg Kyabgon says, by recognizing these attractions and thought patterns, we can gradually learn to relinquish our fixation on the wrong view. That is, we can relinquish the idea that our experiences and perspectives are entirely real. Thus, with the wrong view, we see things in isolation and as standalone truths and entities with great certainty. With wrong view, we see things either in terms of affirmation or negation, identity, where we identify affirmatively with the object, or difference, where we do not identify with the object and negate or are at odds with the object. And this we looked at last time. So what we mean with wrong view is not that it's something that the Buddha said that's wrong, or it's not even as if it's like wrong in a mathematical equation. It's just basically, well, we could maybe say that, but the problem is it's non-truth. So we're basically delusional and we're not really aligned with reality. It's like going down the street the wrong way. So we're going to collide with reality, and that's where we continually suffer. So that's what we mean with wrong view. Now, this standalone perception of truth then is wrong view. This idea that there is things are in one way or another, or not, then this is where we're not really aware of how things are, and that's simply what we then refer to as wrong view. The insight, and this is what we're going to be looking at here, developing a liberated perspective, this chapter. The remedy is the insight of seeing how things are in relation, how things stand, not as standalone, but actually they're just part of a web, a display of dynamic phenomena that operate in relationship. They don't stand alone. Like Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal says, everything leans, everything is dependent. So seeing the relational nature of all phenomena is seeing dependent arising. Big, possibly the biggest buzzword in Buddhism. Praticca samutpada, dependent arising. Now, when we begin to see that, that is prajna, that's insight. It's not particularly even that philosophical. It's just that we begin to be more flexible in a way, but it's being less caught up in ourselves and opening up for a broader perspective. And it's through, we develop the ability to see this dependent arising through the path of cultivating wisdom, of cultivating then prajna. This, of course, is what we're doing along the whole path in terms of our study, in terms of our critical thinking about what we've studied, and then the application, meditation. So The point is, we recognize with dependent arising, within that insight, we recognize that things are dependent and they do not endure. They have no reality. This is the bad news. If you like, if we're hooked on our habitual patterns, it's the bad news. They don't last, they have no reality, they're dependent. But the good news is the suffering that we inevitably have from our wrong view is curable. It's ultimately really just about us looking at things, and that's where we make this discovery. Actually, it doesn't make anything go away. It's just that we begin to see clearer. We see with more colors, we see with more texture, more flavor, and so forth. So as practitioners, then we apply this insight, and it's then gradually that we experience the insubstantial, untangible nature of things. Emptiness might sound like, oh, there's nothing there, but it really just means we need to sort of wake up to the fact that we can't grasp things. But not grasping things and seeing them for what they are doesn't mean that they go away. It just means that we cease to be kind of silly in terms of our not properly seeing things. So emptiness is like Tongsikens Rinpoche, it's a bit like if we're in the movies and we're caught up and the Buddha taps us gently on the shoulder and says, it's just a movie. Doesn't make the movie go away, but all of a sudden we're less caught. Traleg Rinpoche says, so we may experience the insubstantial nature of all things, also referred to in Buddhism as emptiness, or being empty of inherent existence. The way it is expressed in Buddhism is that first you have to have Dharma knowledge, that is, knowledge of dependent arising. The knowledge does not just remain as knowledge because in Buddhism, attachment to that knowledge itself is seen as a form of delusion. As long as there is some remaining attachment to the knowledge as a static, solid truth, there is still delusion. There is still mental fixation to be overcome. So imagine the sage. The beautiful thing about the sage is that the sage doesn't go hammering truth. The sage is free from the view. The sage has translated this insight, saying, oh, it's just a movie. Oh, it's empty. From being this thought into experience. So the sage is free, and is even free of this this knowledge in the sense of having a view. And this, of course, also we already began discussing last time. We're talking about wrong view, right view, and then no view. And that's where the freedom and the beauty, this you'll see also, is this absence of reference as to this dependent arising as some sort of dogma. So, but it's initially important. There has to initially be this insight. Yeah, things don't actually last. They don't really, if we analyze, they don't really exist actually the way that we think they do. They're actually dependent phenomena, and hence they are ultimately without solid inherent existence. If we fully integrate the realization of dependent arising, we have transcended view, as we just discussed. At that point, we don't need a view. View is needed when we see things in a particular way with strong habits. That's why it's necessary for us to sit down and say, okay, what's real here? And that's what we do with all the various analytical practices that are important. It sort of shakes us and wakes us up. Transcendence of view follows adopting the right view. So the right view means we're on the path to reality. We have it as a as a knowledge, but ultimately then we go beyond this. That's a transcendent of view. This transcendence of view. This process is based on skillfully changing our mind. And this is the beauty of the Buddha's teaching, is that the Buddha taught how to actually extract ourselves from delusion. Not that the Buddha said, this is how it is, get with it. No, the Buddha actually enabled us to follow through, beginning where we are, not setting a high standard of how we ought to be, but relating to how we actually are. And that's skillful means. That's what we do in terms of the path. We change the mind in that we open it up, take it from being narrow-minded into exposing it to reality, and that's what we refer to as changing our mind. Traleg Rinpoche says, realization in Buddhism is not the realization of correct view as such. It is the transcendence of all views. We we utilize samidita, right view. In Sanskrit, that would be samyak dishti. Yeah, samyak dishti. So anyway, in Pali, samaditi, right view. In order to reach that level, in order to reach the state of no view. In that respect, then, right view has a vital and important place in one's spiritual journey and attainments. So we need to have this insight into dependent arising. All right, on a mundane level, what does a fully integrated realization of dependent arising look like? It looks like actually being very comfortable in the world, being fully engaged in the world. If you meet a sage, they'll be fully present within the world. And that's what we then, a fully integrated realization of dependent arising is then liberation. So that's where we look to teachers. Why Buddhist teachers are given such reverence is because they have this. This is why we put them on a throne. If they don't have it, well, they might be, they might be teachers who can convey this to us, but what we regard as a refuge, Buddhas, the Guru, and so forth, this is what it looks like. This is when this realization is embodied. And what is wonderful about the Buddhist teaching is that we don't only have the, you could say, handed down academic knowledge, but we still have a lineage of realization. So that's in the ordinary conventional level. Of course, on the absolute, there's no difference between Buddhas and sentient beings, and etc., etc. But in terms of our conventional level, this is where you could say the Nyamanakaya, or the Tuku, or the teacher is like, you could say, is someone who's there manifested on the basis of our merit. We can actually see someone who embodies this. Right view means right understanding. It is to understand the centrality of how we are seeing things subjectively. See, when we begin to analyze phenomena, it's not really the problem lies in the phenomena, it's about how we're seeing phenomena. And that's where the right understanding is about correcting us. It's not that we need to change the object or we need to in any way adjust things. Of course, we're not saying that it's not good to have good sort of inventions and gadgets and so on. There's all science, of course, around all the objects and how we can manipulate it. But actually, samsara and the suffering and the confusion that perpetuates suffering universally, that doesn't lie in something out there in terms of the objects. We can't take a pill and get better. It's not about rewiring our brain and all, putting some chip inside. It's about adjusting how we see things. And that operates, this is where the science that only treats the object is a very limited, confined science. The complete science includes the subjectivity, the place where we adjust what actually is the perceiving, the observer of reality. So this understanding is intimate and transformative. When we apply right view, this is something that happens. It's about us beginning to no longer be caught up in the patterns that drive suffering in terms of attachment and aversion. Beginning to just see that things are what they are, and they're different depending on how we see them. The more we identify and understand the complexity of our perceptions, the less we're caught by them. And that's where this is an intimate process in the terms of its personal journey. It's transformative. And that is what right understanding or right view consists of. With right understanding, our consciousness goes through a significant shift. This knowledge is Dharma, as in the knowledge of the nature of all phenomena. So, what is it we call it? If you speak Tibetan. I don't know what it is in Sanskrit, but this is where we begin to understand reality. That's why the insight of the sage is also universal. It's not that the sage is just an expert on Buddhism. That's the beauty of the sage. The sage has gone beyond Buddhism, has gone beyond view. And that's where there's a knowledge of reality, of Dharma. Traleg Kyabgon says, when change or transformation in our perception occurs, we realize an experience dependent arising. When we experience dependent arising, we do not need the aid of right view. We do not need that perspective anymore, as we do not need to remind ourselves to hold that perspective. This perspective is called middle view, both in Mahayana Buddhism and in early Buddhism. The reason it is called middle view is because it refuses to lend significance to either one of the binary concepts, identity or difference, by saying it is like this, or it is not like that, or it is the same, or it is different. So this middle view or middle way view or Madhyamika, this is actually the view that's beyond any dogma, any reference point. And that's where we begin to see reality, because we're not filtering it. We're not only seeing a partial reality. And that's why this freeing ourselves from these dogmatic reference points, that's the way to liberation. And that's why we would say this is essential for liberation. Okay. Okay. Could we say as an analogy that wrong views are like a patient being sick, unwell, and the right view is the medicine prescribed by the doctor? Yes. By taking the medicine, we can overcome the sickness eventually. Then no view or going beyond view is when we achieve this state of well-being, of full health. No need to take the remedy anymore. Yes. You know why that's such a good analogy? Because when we're completely cured, we don't think in terms of sick, not sick. You know, we're just back to what we are. And there we don't even need the reference point of the medicine or of the sickness. We don't define ourselves as patients. We don't define ourselves in terms of being in recovery or whatever. So that's a very good analogy. The statement that the true science includes subjectivity seems a difficult one to entertain in an everyday context where objectivity is seen to go hand in hand with logic. Perhaps the issue lies with speaking of a complete science. Yes, well, exactly. I mean, what we have is this confined notion of science as only being what we can objectify, you know, in terms of what can be measured, quantified, etc. But Buddhism doesn't limit itself to that, and Buddhism particularly includes the observer, the experience, and that's where we then have a more complete science, yes, or greater science, and that is also founded on logic. We'll look at that actually in terms of a little bit later about, you know, what is valid knowledge. So yes. So you could say this perspective is more extensive than the ordinary notion of science, but it is nevertheless science because it is founded on logic. Sorry, but could you give us another example of dependent arising? Well, for example, the famous example we very often have of freeing ourselves from delusion and realization is when you have this realization is then that we think we come walking along and we all of a sudden see what we think is a snake, and it's through looking there and seeing that yes, we thought there was a snake, but when we analyze, it's really just a rope that has all the conditions there that make it look like a snake, but there is actually no snake. And that's, you could say, a dependent arising. It looks as if there's something, but if we actually look, there are really just some conditions there, but there's actually no reality to it. And the thing is also, once we've seen that there is no snake, we're not going back, generally. You know, it's not like, oh, there is no snake, there is no snake, and then we're kind of doubting it. Once you see that there's a rope, you generally cure it from that. In regards to the binary concepts, it says identity or difference. Does our confused state then constantly refer some sort of identity and then fixate on whether something aligns with it or differs from it? Yes, that's exactly it. So that's why we would say this is, for example, a cup. And then we would attribute cup. And then we would begin to say, oh, that's not cup. Of course, conventionally, yeah, that functions. But the thing is, when we begin to solidify things, this is my career, this is my love, this is my reputation, this is my dignity, this is my house, this is my bank account, whatever. All of these things, they elicit tremendous emotion. And the thing is, as we know from everyday life, we get so tangled up in this. And that's where, when we begin to analyze what we call, actually apply the middle way or middle view reasonings, that's where we begin to unsettle these assumptions and begin to see that phenomena actually just exist as a set of conditions that appear in one way or another, but they have no reality in and of themselves. In the example of illness, medicine, well-being, what is the process in which you're recovered, but you dwell on that period of time? Well, it's that process that we're doing through the path. Right now we're delusional, but then we calm down, we begin to look at what it is that drives our assumptions, our delusion, and so forth. And we develop the prajna through a process of first hearing the teaching, what the Buddha is saying. He's saying, there's not a snake there, it's just a rope. And we look and we go, oh yeah. And then it becomes true for us. And then realizing that is then where we recover. So in terms of how we do this in terms of the path, the Buddhist path, the Noble Eightfold Path, the path of ethics, concentration, and wisdom, and so on. What are the causes of dependent arising? Actually, it's delusion. It's where we begin to say this and that, self and other, duality. Then there's a question, would you say that right view is the reminder that brings us to transcend all views and experiencing the way things are, which is dependent arising? Yes. And of course, when we're applying right view, we are seeing things validly as they are, and we can also see that things exist beyond our view. At the same time, we require the process of habituating ourselves, and that's where while we're introduced to the way things ultimately are, we temporarily need a process, and that's the path. But yes, it's on the basis of the path that we continually are reminded and that we're continually coming back to this. Yeah. Okay. Dependent arising certainly does not mean things do not exist. Remember that. Oh, by the way, if you go on the Siddhartha Intent website, there's some news on the website that because tomorrow is what we call Sagadawa Duchen, then there is we'll be having a resounding here. That's also on the website. There's also a chanting of the Heart Sutra that's going to begin midnight New Zealand time, which is 10 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. So if you like to join in, you can. It's going to be via Zoom. So if you go on the website si.org.au, then you can join that. But it's in the Heart Sutra that we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form, etc. And that's mean that we never ever are talking about things and there's nothing there. It just means that things they exist in dependency, they lean. So dependent arising certainly does not mean things do not exist, nor does it mean that things do exist, because in that they lean, they're dependent, they don't have this autonomous identity, this unchanging solid reality. So these two extremes, they lie in believing in our fixated perspective. I do this all the time. I sort of think, oh my God, this is happening, you know, this, that, all the realities that I'm fixating on, they appear to me to exist in a way that I then begin to generate these sort of attachment, aversion, and so forth. The beauty of the middle way view, is that it frees us from these extremes of fixation. We see that things have actually not come into existence. They don't have an abiding reality. So that's where, as soon as we might think, oh, Madhyamika, it's terrible, I could never understand it. But actually, the moment that you begin to question anything, you're already beginning to go there. The moment that you ask something with a WH, why, where, you're actually beginning to see the complexity of things. The moment that you think critically, the moment that you sit down and have a discussion with somebody, notice how each has their own view. The object obviously is not existing unanimously. We have different perspectives. So that's where we initially establish this freedom. Okay. So what this does is not equip us with a new set of dogmas, but it just enables us to see things in a less skewed and a less tainted way. We begin to see things as they are, as they exist in their dynamic nature, free of our fixation. That's where we begin to understand that things are just continually changing and they don't have the reality that we attribute to them. So we're really just beginning to see things as they are. Of course, we might say, hey, wait a minute. If they have no reality, how can we say we're seeing things as they are? So let's just say we're seeing them in a less confused or tainted way. And this is something that is useful, not just in terms of our path to enlightenment, where it is essential, but it's also essential in us on an everyday level. We have to be discerning. We have to actually be smart about things. We need to not be fooled by appearances. If somebody says somebody's selling you a car, you're going to look under the hood. If somebody's trying to, sell you an idea or whatever, you need to be discerning. It works all the time that we question, we challenge assumptions. Traleg says, if we understand that, then we realize that ultimately there's nothing to get fixated on because of the dynamic quality of the world and our potentially dynamic experience of that world. We can have a stable viewpoint about different subjective experiences of the world. Nevertheless, we can still recognize that there is nothing to get fixated on. So I could say, I have my car, I have this place where I'm living, sure, but to fixate on it as some absolute reality, impossible, absolutely impossible. There's nothing that has any ultimate existence once we begin to look at it, analyze. Traleg says, the middle view encompasses different viewpoints and philosophical positions. These are tolerated, as some may even be accepted as an expression of the middle view. There may also be differences in how the middle view is expressed in different contexts. The middle view can be expressed in social or economic terms, in relation to the environment, or in terms of ethics, and so on. The middle view can be expressed in many contexts, not just within Buddhist teaching. The same conclusion has been drawn by many scholars. The middle view does not adopt a single theoretical position whereby everything else is seen as false. See, the middle view actually ultimately is about ending all views, strangely enough. And we universally tend to operate with not falling into extremes, like saying, oh, if it's not this, it must be that. Well, it's not like that, really. Our reality is continually, we continually try to operate with some sort of golden mean, or some understanding that truth is something very relative. So this is something also Traleg mentioned, that this is also very sort of basic to postmodern thinking, that there is no real truth. But of course, and this is helpful when we're relating to the world. When we're talking with others, we understand they're seeing things from a different angle. So there's no ultimate truth in terms of the object as such, but also there is some relative, reference points, of course. The beauty here is that we don't actually need to ultimately subscribe to any view, and that's possibly what many will find incredibly beautiful, philosophically very elegant, but more than that, it's really about the applied experience of that we are not bogging ourselves down with some single dogma or single theoretical position. Okay. Does dependent arising exist objectively? I mean, does it work beyond the subject who cognizes it? Yes, it's the nature of reality. And if you don't believe me, check. while we see things have not really come into reality, we still see how messy things look in the world right now. Well, they're really just relative according to who's looking at it. Messy? That's a very subjective value judgment. You know, things might be messy from, from the point of view of, well, us, but, we might find, for example, corporate greed messy, or bad administration for governments, or pollution, or somebody is leaving their socks in the in the in the bedroom or whatever. But the socks, they don't think we're messy. It's entirely based on who's seeing it. The corporate greed, well, it's good to the shareholders, right, etc., etc. How does this apply in this current climate with racial prejudice, protest, etc.? Well, the whole of samsara is suffering, and on the basis of our confusion, on the basis of this lack of understanding, dependent arising, we all of a sudden have prejudice. Then we begin to say this person is bad, and then the protest. That's the other camp then saying those persons who say that person is bad, they're bad, and so we have this endless conflict. So of course, we need, what we're implying with the middle way view is that we are engaging with reality as it is and beginning to take out the particular toxic attitudes, which are these prejudices and the aggression and the anger and so forth. Messy as messy as in a mess, not in terms of neat and tidy, but just in terms of so much suffering and aggression in protests right now. Yes, well, that's exactly, that is due to not seeing things for what they are. We engage me against the other, us against them, black against white, good against bad. So this is what this is perfect example of how samsara originates. This is perfect example of why what we're studying here is so incredibly important, because that is where we are there's the Buddha saying, look, try and look instead of just being stuck on your own particular attitude, your own particular perception. See that it's complex. There's no good, bad, and so forth. Reality doesn't exist in these terms, these sort of toxic terms that we provide to them on the basis of our confused projections. So we're taking the medicine right now. The more we look at the news these days, the more we should recognize the value of understanding dependent arising and all basically the non-aggression that comes from dependent arising. The right view is the view of the middle way, freedom from fixation. So it's when we begin to let go of our prejudices and our attitudes and all the aggression and toxicity that comes from that we appreciate the value of it. And this is why the right view is called the right view. But understand again, and what we're saying with the middle way is that this is not a dogma, but it's about us dissolving dogma. So ultimately, the experience of the middle way view extends beyond understanding. See, this is realization or experience. This is something that goes beyond just an idea or something intellectual. Relatively, the middle way of words enables communication. So this is what we call in Tibetan sigiuma. Traleg doesn't mention that, but that is essentially what the sage, as he was saying, in order to communicate this with the world, uses words. That's why, yes, we have a book, we are studying a book. This looks like words, this looks like a Buddhist book and so forth, but it needs the words for us to free ourselves from the rigidity of the insecurity and confusion of self that fails to see reality. And so that's where we need the words. But the realized person is free. They need no view. And yet out of compassion, they will engage with teaching the right view, teaching the path. Traleg says, we may think that if someone realizes a state that transcends all view, that the individual has no use for any kind of viewpoint. It is true that the person may not have any need for views, but in order to communicate, in order to engage with the world, one should still have to approach it via samadhi, via the right view. So on the conventional level, the liberated person may still make use of the right view. I still had to see a movie called Patch Adams. I think it was Robin Williams that had this role, but he would go into conflict situations and simply just make people laugh. And see, there's an element of beginning to see dependent arising when we begin to see that our so comical the way we bog ourselves down in our particular view. And the vipassana, the wider perspective, is when we begin to be free of that. This is not about being silly or taking something tragic lightheartedly, but it's about introducing perspective. So that is what we mean with the sage engaging with the world in one way or another. Well, engaging skillfully. Ultimately, letting go requires the attaining of the state of no view. This requires understanding wrong and right view. This leads us to ultimate liberation, meaning there is a path for us where we initially begin with understanding what is wrong view in terms of our aggression and our fixation, grasping what we've studied here, and then introducing a wider perspective, the right view. And this ultimately frees us, leads us to realization. Traleg says, what we call realization is not about understanding the view, it's about embodying the reality purported by the view. So what is meant by insight into reality or gaining knowledge into reality is that one comes to embody that very reality that one has developed some understanding of. So there ceases to be any separation between the idea and the experience. So this means that we begin to have first an idea, and then gradually we see the reality of it, and this becomes our reality. We own it. This becomes our experience. Insight into dependent arising enables us to connect with the world. Other than that, we're not connecting with the world. We're standing with our filters, again, coming back to the present day conflicts. They're about, this is my attitude, this is my view. And we're actually not connecting with the world. We're just stuck in our bubble of our projections. So with insight into dependent arising, we will be less fixated and come to experience the middle way view. We will gain broader understanding beyond dogma and doctrine. Again, this is the beauty of what the Buddha is saying. He's not saying become a Buddhist, he's saying become enlightened. Well, and then again, he is saying become a Buddhist in the terms of having a journey that goes through the identifying wrong view, understanding right view, and then, yes, as Dharmakirti would say, it is the doctrine or the teaching is what takes us across the ocean. It's a vessel or a boat. Once we get to the other side, there's no need for it anymore. So ultimate reality is beyond the view. Dependent arising implies mind and matter are not independent. And again, coming back to what we would call complete science, is that we understand that our identifying what appears as solid reality or solid phenomena is in fact something that is imputed, and the experience of our solid world is imputed by the mind. And that's again where we also understand the dependent arising. We understand that there is no solid reality independent of the mind. Our world is constructed on the basis of our mind. Okay, now this might sound trippy to some, but it is of course just the fact that we are the ones that are constructing the world through our observation. Traleg says, we cannot step outside our mind and experience the world. That does not mean only the mind exists. Rather, it means we apprehend and experience the world in a particular way because of the kind of mind we have. This includes the influence of our beliefs, dispositions, and habitual tendencies on how we see and experience the world generally. Now, I think everybody has this experience that how we have a good day and a bad day has a lot to do with our attitudes, have a lot to do with our mind. And it's interesting that when we have a particular aggressive, uptight, nervous, mind, then we also see animosity and things that threaten us around us. Whereas when we have a relaxed, open mind, then we encounter a lot of friendliness, a lot of inspiration. And this, of course, leads us to the discussion around the Yogacarya or mind-only school. There's a little bit of sometimes difference in understanding what we call mind-only school and Yogacarya. But anyway, it is really the Yogacarya that, and the mind-only, that identifies and treats this issue of the mind as being key to what we experience as reality. The Yogacarya view factors in the role of the mind in our perception. So sometimes in the objectivist view, there's sort of what we call causal closure, which means that the world out there is closed. It's nothing to do with consciousness. And that's where you could say that's sort of the standard model of physics that traditionally would say that. But of course, quantum physics has challenged that since over 100 years. And the observer is very much part of whatever reality that might appear to us. Now, the Yogacarya view recognizes the shared perceptions of groups of sentient beings. So, for example, in the human realm, we very much experience a shared understanding of what we call houses, for example. Whereas if we were an animal, we wouldn't have that notion of house or cars or whatever it might be. So we should understand that mind only does not imply that there's nothing out there. This is interesting because there's some sort of, how do you say, the solipsistic view that all I'm experiencing is just as in my own head. And that actually, strangely enough, is basic to some scientific notions of what our perceptions are. However, in the Buddhist understanding, we're not saying that there's nothing out there, but we're just talking about how what we construct in terms of our experience is very much about informed by and driven by our mind and the material that's in our mind. So what we intend to do with the path then is that we're working with that, and this changes our perception. If you ever notice Buddhist paintings like the Buddha fields and so forth, we're not talking about some sort of strange place out there somewhere. It's just that when we begin to remove our filters, we begin to see things clearer. Then we begin to see a quality, a luminous quality of our reality. Anyway, so positive emotions, when we engage our psychological material with positive emotions, it's something that overcomes negative emotions. It renders the negative emotions benign. And then positive emotions then is something that overcomes negative karma. If we begin to have, positive karma overcomes negative karma, we begin to put down some positive patterns, it's going to be weakening the tendencies of negative karma. Ultimately, realization, we wake up from the dream. Then we don't worry about whether we're having a good dream or bad dream. We're awake. We're gone beyond the dream. We've gone beyond karma altogether. As such, then we work through stages of the path. And this is something that's basic to the notion of our cure as a patient, as somebody on the path. We're getting better. It's not that we only get that much better. This is a curable illness. So we continue until we're completely cured. So this, of course, runs counter to our lazy habit, which would be, hey, I just want to have a package here. I don't want to go through a path. I just want to be told the truth. I just want to sign up. Could I please just have it easy? And that's the annoying thing about the Buddhist path is we've been diagnosed with a condition that needs to be treated. We need to do something about it. Going beyond habits does not mean we no longer can discriminate what is good and bad. So meaning that we're beyond good and bad or habits and so on. It doesn't mean that we can't discriminate. Of course, on a conventional level, we do see what's helpful, what's not helpful. It's not helpful to be aggressive. It's very helpful to be open-minded. So going beyond habits actually enables us to see that even clearer. The more we go beyond habits, the more skillful we are in relating to the world. This is also a point Traleg makes a lot. So we discriminate, but without attachment and fixation. Simply seeing what works is seeing clearly, and we see clearly because we don't have attachment and fixation. So we have a different kind of discrimination. It's not prejudice, but it's rather seeing what's what. Traleg says, our discriminatory awareness is born out of insight and not out of prejudice, bias, and mental fixation. From the Buddhist point of view, we will always need to make decisions, and we make them based on our desire. There's nothing wrong with that. The main thing is not to get caught up with too much indecision. We do not need to become too anxious or worried or allow all kinds of disturbing emotions to arise based on our decisions. This is on a very practical level in terms of us relating to the world and relating freely. Okay. Oh. How does the Zen tradition of meditating on koans relate to this discussion on the view? Oh, exactly what we're saying here is the koans are supposed to stop the conceptual mind. That's where we begin to have this experience of no view. So, of course, the koan is very much based on the Chan tradition, which in the Mahayana tradition is interestingly referred to as the, what is it again, Nimbo Donji Juba, the absolute essential lineage. We generally talk about Yogacarya, Madhyamika, but we would also sometimes say there's a third lineage, and that's where this is the teaching that Nagarjuna taught then, that went to Bodhidharma, and that's, you'd say, the highest. That's the non-gradual approach, and that's where you just instantly go to the non-view. And this is where the Indians and the Tibetans, they were a little bit more, you could say, pragmatic in some sense. They would say, you need to first operate with wrong and right view. They acknowledged for sure that there would be some extraordinary individuals that right away could jump to the no view. But it's generally seen as being a bit difficult. There was a big debate in Tibet actually around this. So, but it is very much in the same, it's exactly the same here. It's simply just that method here, stopping the mind, is intended to enable the view of no view, but then again, it also enables the right view. It begins to see how the flawed quality of our conceptual mind. Watch it, great movie. Yeah, okay. So to realize beings not see the aggression in process for self-determination as aggression, and instead seeing it as a movie without any emotional response. No, that's what we're talking about here. There's very much discerning involved, but it's also discerning that you see, for example, this aggression. This aggression is cause of suffering. So that would see the aggression is the wrong view. To relinquish aggression, let's say to engage in dialogue, that would be right view. And the realized being would see that more clearly. Of course, they themselves, you could say, are beyond view, but they would also understand relatively. This is where we talk about the conventional truth, and this is where we talk about the compassionate quality as they are, but also understanding how things are seen for others. So that kind of compassion enables us to understand how others are experiencing it. Is the experience of the middle way view a bodily experience, like sitting in a meditation or doing the Nundro practices of prostrations or mantle offerings? No, the middle way view is possibly facilitated by sitting in meditation, because the mind calms down and becomes clearer. Just like if we're about to fly off the handle and somebody says, take a deep breath. Actually, what we're doing then is engaging the middle way view. We begin to, as we're taking our deep breath, we begin to see, possibly we could see things in a different way. We begin to see how our fixation was toxic. Can you speak about getting caught up in indecision and understanding karmic consequences? I have an underlying worry that the decision can reinforce wrong view, wrong action. Yeah, actually, it's interesting. The Tibetans talk about dependent arising sometimes as auspicious coincidence, and sometimes we can have, the less we're caught up in our prejudice, aggression, speed, and so forth, the more we're able to actually see, should I go this way or that way? You know, then we begin to actually being less caught up, you know, less with blinkers. We begin to have some greater capacity to make decisions and see what is the skillful way forward. Our grasping nature, actually, just in the last question there, that's kind of exactly what that's about. Our grasping nature causes our grasping nature causes or clouds our clarity. It always bothers me when I've done any of these typos. Our grasping nature clouds our clarity. Yeah, causes it to be clouded. Yeah. All right, and that clouds our decisions. But it is not easy not to grasp. So we begin with easing our worry. We should be lighthearted and not take ourselves too seriously. We need a balance between relating wholeheartedly to the world and being light. And that's where, again, the humor, lightheartedness is not just frivolous about us having a good time, maybe even on the expense of others. But lightheartedness here means more about also us not taking ourselves seriously and beginning to actually see that reality is not fixed in one way or another, and that it can be sometimes funny when we're stuck on just our particular perspective. So that's where that's one way of beginning to be less caught up. We get very serious, we lose our perspective. Traleg Kyabgon says building self-knowledge in that way, and as we know, by the way, self-knowledge here, of course, means just being wise and knowing what's happening within the subjective dimension. So building self-knowledge in that way over time helps us get a handle on what is going on in our minds. Through our desires, we can motivate and propel ourselves toward a more uplifted reality and experience. Sometimes in our enthusiasm, we may want to renounce everything and retire to the Himalayas and live in a cave. But practically speaking, it might be more profitable to deal with what we can do, what we can work on, and not fantasize about what is less likely to be happening. Yeah. Chapter 6, Rationality and Conviction. And this sounds very serious and dry, but it's not. And all of us are actually brought up in our culture to respect rationality incredibly. And also conviction is an admirable quality. It's actually being determined, seeing and sticking to what we see is true. So this is very often what we in the tradition refers to as establishing the view, and then conviction is more on the level of faith and actually being able to work going beyond even the narrowness or the linear quality of rationality. Going even beyond that is then what we refer to as conviction of faith. So Traleg Kyabgon says the popular image might be that you go to Thailand, Burma, or Tibet and see monks and nuns as renunciants who have renounced many worldly things. We may consider that they have worked on their desire and therefore they have no more dealings with the world. This understanding of Buddhism and what it means to be a renunciant monk or nun is mistaken. It has more to do with developing a positive attitude towards desire in order to engage in the world more effectively than wanting to have no more dealings with the world. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at exactly that. In Western philosophy, and actually there's quite an extensive treatment of this in Traleg Kyabgon's book. I'm not going to attempt to summarize all of it, or I am summarizing it, but I would say it's very worthwhile to actually read through it, because it touches on so many of the, you could say, aspects of the outlook that we generally have in what we would call the Western world, or in the modern world. In Western philosophy, emotions and desire are generally opposed to reason and faith. Some philosophers, like Hume and Nietzsche, accommodate desire and human emotion. So that's sort of more on the, within the last, well, Hume is quite some time ago, but still, the general notion is that in Western philosophy, emotions, desire, that's sort of the dark side, or that's what brings humans down. And actually what brings humans up is reason and faith, and, you know, in philosophy, reason, within religion, faith. And that's where we would, you could say there's the two, the sort of the devil and the angel that are battling there. So that's where in Christianity sometimes, and this Traleg makes a point, this is not about putting Christianity down or marketing Buddhism, but it's just there's different approaches, and we need to identify the differences here. And sometimes in Christianity there is the notion that what defines a human is that they can actually manage their desire. And what, for example, defines an animal is that they don't particularly in any way administrate their desire. This, of course, is hugely anthropocentric, and but that's sort of a general notion of the quality of being a human, is that we can lift ourselves up on the basis of reason and so forth. Now, Buddhism has a different approach, and again, this is not about better or worse, but it's rather just so we can be clear about what's what. And that is that in Buddhism, we're working with all of that. The rational capacity and the emotional inclinations coincide. We're working with understanding, but also we're very much integrating and being continually working with the raw material of our mind, with all its particular emotional inclinations. Traleg says, if we look at Buddha's own discourses, we can see that the Buddha did not say we should only think clearly. The Buddha did say, however, that we should reason well in order to overcome certain forms of desire. What the Buddha said was that we should reason well and exercise awareness and mindfulness together. So reason is a very helpful tool, but it's still just thought, and it's not an ultimate end in itself in any way. But it can be useful in terms of working with our being. But working with our being is working with our emotions and so forth. Also, we have, and this also in the, I think it was Germaine Greer or the feminists certainly early on pointed out how there was this discrepancy in Western philosophy, where you have the very sort of cerebral male thing about spirit, and the sort of the female was sort of the soul and sort of the experience of emotion and so forth. And there was this suppression, again, that's reflected in this discussion of the soul in terms of in favor of the spirit and the higher and the reason and the linear and all of that. So there's that kind of very male-oriented intelligence that just wishes to achieve mental or philosophical clarity, and the sort of the existing quality of lived experience of emotion and so forth is sort of essentially suppressed, or not seen as valid in terms of the purpose of life or the purpose of our being and so forth. So this is not about good versus bad, rather it's about discerning what is disruptive and what is not. I mean, we could even say there's samsara, nirvana, and it's not as if one is better or worse, it's just in one there is an experience of suffering, and the other there's not. It's just about causes and conditions. But of course, due to, you could say, our Buddha nature and so forth, there is a wish to extract ourselves from what is this you could say, unconstructive, stumped existence that samsara is. And that's where we want to appreciate what it is that gets in the way and what doesn't. So with the presence of desire, we can become ungrounded and may well indulge in sloppy thinking. So this very often happens, that when we experience desire, if there's something we want, it might be somebody, it might be sex, it might be something about material things that we're obsessing about or whatever, then we begin to sort of, lose our clarity and we begin to sort of just buy into some sort of poor excuses for pursuing these what ultimately drives our suffering. So understanding then what it is that's happening within our mind, it's more about then beginning to just be clear on what's what. Traleg Kyabgon says, what is different about Buddhism when compared to other philosophies and religious traditions is that in Buddhism, faith, reason, and the practice of mindfulness awareness are all emphasized together. When these come together, we're better able to deal with different forms of desire. There is no one single thing that is called desire which could automatically make us become sinful. We are not simply talking about sexual desire or physical desire for food because of hunger or for drink because of thirst, but all kinds of desire, including the desire for security, to extend life, to end life, and so on. So all these wants that we have, they are what we need to be attentive to. It's not as, and it's all based on a number of causes and conditions. So in Buddhism, the various kinds of desires are clearly dealt with. Like Traleg Kyabgon points out, this is huge. In Buddhism, this is principally what so much of the teaching is about. There's an enormous amount of attention put on desire, and this is something that's you could say it's something that's very clearly dealt with. It's not vague in any way. It's not like you have to become enlightened and you should forget all about anything else. We're very much dealing with you could say the dark side, or we're dealing with these sort of non-linear processes of desire. So often we're clouded or unaware of the desire that rules us. We lack this introspection that knows what's going on. And we often maybe fail to actually understand how we should deal with it. So that's where the rationality of the teaching, and also that which goes beyond rationality, namely faith, it can enable us to be free. We want to sort of understand this better, and this is actually needed. We actually need to deal with these really essential aspects of our existence. That is why we study Nagarjuna, the middle way view, Chandrakirti, the Dalai Lama, because this is actually touching about what we're experiencing. So we will, through these studies, be able to address our issues more fully. Also, what can help is life stories of great men and women who then, through their example, they provide great insight, support, and inspiration. So together, this dimension of faith, something that goes beyond sort of the ordinary linear mind, something that deeply touches us, and then the logic, the hard intelligence of reason, these together can affect a great change. Traleg talks about logical empiricism like the Vienna Circle, and the notion that we only trust what we can directly, objectively measure, quantify, and assert as empirically existing. This kind of what we call empiricism has its limits. It does not fully cover all our conditions simply because it's confined to just what is understood as empirical, in the sense of what's objectifiable or measurable, what can be, what's out there. We need to include, to have a complete science, we need experience, rationality, and conviction. So we need to include this dimension of felt experience. These three, experience, rationality, and conviction, enable us to distinguish between desire that aids us and desire that traps us. So this we've talked about some before, but this is where we then have these three, as you could say, the tools. So we need to combine the experience of practice with understanding and conviction. And this made me think of this lovely quote from Trungpa, where he says, "It's very important for you to study if you want to survive. If you don't study, you're going to perish, as if you didn't have any oxygen left. If you don't study, you can't teach. And if you don't teach, you will die in depression. It is very important for you to realize the importance of this. If you don't understand the Dharma because of your lack of personal interest in learning all its details and subtleties, then you're committing yourself to a meditative nut house. You can sit a lot, But so what? If you don't study, you don't have compassion, you don't have sympathy to others in the world, you become so mean just sitting by yourself and practicing that there is no outlet, no way to do anything at all. And the point really is that we can't isolate ourselves as Buddhists who just do our Buddhist thing. We need to be in conversation with our world, and that is compassionate. And we need to master language. We need, not just for communicating, but also for our own sake, we actually need to be clear on what it is that we're doing. And that's where we need the dimensions that are spoken about here. Experience in terms of knowing what's happening with us, clarity of rationality, and this brings us then to a wider, you could say, a higher plane of beginning to see clearly, of faith and conviction. Okay. What if we desire to be on the path, but our family and friends don't support that? Is that seen as an obstacle or a blessing depending on how one perceives? Following the path seems serious in the sense of commitment, changing to remain light about it. Challenging to remain light about it. Could you comment? Well, yeah, that's where we do need to go beyond seeing this, what appears to be the impediment of family and friends, and actually see the dependent arising of that. We could see if our family and friends don't like us practicing Buddhism, it's because of their particular view. They probably would see it as some sort of cult or an expression of ignorance. So we need to have sympathy for them. And that sympathy should actually drive then our deeper commitment to working on our own sanity. And understanding others is the path itself. So that's where it is very helpful to be lighthearted about it. Of course, in terms of practicalities, there's a lot of detail, but it's very often that if we have a certain lightheartedness about it and we have a lot of sympathy, it facilitates that we then find the way forward in terms of the practical aspects of it. May I ask, where is the Trungpa Rinpoche quote from? Oh, I forget, and because I forget where it's from, I just Googled it today. I think I Googled Trungpa Nut House. And then it came up. And I think it was from the Chronicles, actually. So it might, I don't know if it's in any of the printed works, but I just remember coming across this quote some time ago. Okay. In Buddhism, the key focus is desire, then how to deal with it. So like we said before, there's a lot of attention put into the notion of how to deal with desire. But it's not just about us sort of seeing, oh, we have a lot of desire, but it's about just, okay, we have a lot of desire, what do we do? So again, these three, experience, rationality, and conviction, empower us to transform. Okay, what we mean with experience is, and of course, you need to read Traleg Rinpoche's book, but what we are talking about is that we know what's happening with ourselves. So that's why we're not just philosophers. We are applying introspection to know what's happening with us. And on the basis of then understanding wrong view, right view, and so on, we operate with a rationality. And that's where then, on the basis of that, we practice. And it's through practice that we then gain certainty in terms of our experience, in terms of a wider perspective. And that empowers us. It gives us the strength, the sense of can-do to transform. So from our own experiences and from the examples of others, meaning we look at the lives of, somebody was talking about the Kaju gurus. This is so important, actually. Also the Nyingma gurus, of course, and Gilu gurus and Sakya gurus, but the men and women who have gone the path before, they are such an example for us. It's very interesting, the process of reading their lives, because even though we might read of persons who live in a different culture, what they're going through is universal. So it's not as if them being Tibetan or Indian is really a big deal. It's about them actually understanding something that applies to every one of us universally and finding a way. And they have so much to say. If you read some of the songs of Saraha or Tilopa or Sri Singha or whatever it might be, Yeshut Sogyal, and so on, there's so much that we actually can learn from that. And also there's a lot of what we call blessing that actually is sort of this sort of visceral quality of just openness that enables us to transform. So from understanding, we learn to transform. And this is what we looked at before also. We need to actually study, and the understanding, once we wouldn't say, oh yeah, this is theory, this is practice. We actually, the moment that we can understand what is talked about, we are having insights in terms of our felt experience. So that is learning on a practical level. Traleg Kyabgon actually, this is interesting, he goes as far as to say in Buddhism we do not, I'll look at it a bit further down, but he effectively says that in Buddhism we do not separate theory and practice, because the theory is about the experience. And this is also so true. We're not talking about some objective nuts and bolts of external phenomena. We're continually coming back to the subjective dimension of what we experience. Now, we take into account that our whole human realm belongs in that category of samsara that's known as the realm of desire. We talk about three realms, the realms of desire, the realms of form, and the formless realm. And that is where we are. We're in the realm of desire, the kama dhatu. It's not karma dhatu, but kama dhatu, the space of desire. Traleg Kyabgon says this is a unique aspect of Buddhism in that we do not make a distinction between theory and practice. Theory is always about practice and vice versa. If you want to practice this or that, you have to have the theory behind it to support the practice. If you have a certain theory, you have to know how to implement that theory. It's not something abstract, something divorced from life experiences. It's part of life's experience. Important point. Working with desire is meditation practice. So different traditions of Buddhism, they deal with desire differently. Also, according to, you might have particular practices as you find them in Thailand, they might in Zen and the Tantric tradition. Also, according to the different yanas, whether you're monastic, whether you're a layperson, whether you're tantric, and so on. But universally, all of these paths are about remedying grasping, clinging, and fixation. So this is regardless of whether this is what we call exoteric, general Buddhist path, or esoteric Buddhism, more like Vajrayana, basically what we call sutra and mantra. So Traleg Kyabgon says, so in Buddhism, it does not matter what we are talking about in relation to desire. As long as we have grasping and clinging and continue to fixate on specific things, we're somewhat lost and limited. If we were not caught up with so much grasping and fixation, we would be free to experience different forms of desire, and we could even make use of these experiences in a constructive fashion. So this you could say applies to all the various methods that we've come across in the Buddhist tradition. Approaching desire through renunciation. And this is, of course, just because we become renunciants and monastics doesn't mean we don't have desire, but we actually have the opportunity to work undisturbed with desire as monastics. So it's important to recognize positive and negative kinds of desire in our mind. And this also actually requires that we have the introspection. So the renunciate approach is not about the world being evil, but to minimize distraction. So in the monastic context, then there is the space to recognize what's happening with our mind and to work with it. So it's not about, I'm going to go to the monastery because the world is a bad place and the monastery is a good place. But it's just that this is where we can get down to business, so to speak. The Buddha did not unanimously promote monasticism, and we can see some arhats, some of the accomplished students, were lay people, also particularly in the Mahayana, then many of the Bodhisattvas obviously were lay people. But the monastery has always been the ideal place for busy people to find peace. And also Traleg was saying that, for example, in Asia, there's a lot, very often there's very confined spaces with people living together. This is definitely a hallmark of the, you could say, unneurotic aspect of Asian people, is there's a lot less, in general, this is just very general, but there's a lot less sort of, you could say, sensitivity around the need for space and all of that. You know, much less focusing on the, yeah, but anyway, yeah, with regards to that, that was Charlie Grims's point, because people very often then are in confined spaces, then the monastic place is then where there's more freedom to actually pursue the study and practice of the path. Now, this is an important point. This pretty much is the rest of chapter 6, which is about that. It's about not focusing on the experience, not the object. So our problem, this we looked at before, there's this famous quote from Tilopa, where he says, you know, Naropa, your problem is not the object, it's your fixating mind. So cut that fixating mind. I think I was using the word shenba, cut the shenba. Our problems are not the object, it is the desire. So we lose ourselves in the object. And the cause for this is the samsaric mind. This is what samsara is. This freezing reality into thinking self, other, object, and so forth. So samsara is not about the external object. It's not about, oh yeah, if you're in retreat or if you're in the monastery, you're not in samsara. Then once you leave the retreat or the monastery, then you are back in samsara. Or that you have a car, or that you have a nice house. It's not as if you have that, then you're definitely in samsara. You know? Or if you have a big family and you have screaming kids and you have to deal with diapers in the middle of the night, then it's not as if that is samsara. It's not about the external objects. Samsara is the samsaric mind. It's about the experience. It's not about the object. Samsara and this mind is what causes relentless discontentment and frustration. So taking time out on retreat or as monastic is not about escaping the world. And this is important when people are monastics or in retreat. It's not about their resenting, the point Charlie Grimshaw made earlier, they're not resenting the world, but they're just taking time to be clear. So you could say ultimately, you know, in the Mahayana certainly there's a notion of we're just away for a time, we're definitely will be coming back in the world again and again and again. But having that opportunity or this space, this is about increasing self-reflection and an understanding of the world. So that's the value of this. Monastic training offers that training. And through that training, then persons are able to, I think we looked at this before, become better persons. It brings about strength on the path. Charlie Grimshaw says, in Buddhism, a person who is totally given over to the samsaric currents of life is seen as a very weak person, a person who gets easily blown around, tossed about in the turbulent water of samsara. As stated in Buddhist literature, one is tossed about without any control. Whether a lay practitioner or a Buddhist monastic, the teachings and training is to become stronger through harnessing the positive forms of desire so that the individual will have the power to work with the negative forms of desire rather than being overwhelmed by them. So this is regardless of whether we are lay persons or monastics, we take time to meditate, to reflect, and so forth. We need that. We might have more time in a monastery. For that reason, the monastery is a very valuable place. We might have less time in an ordinary dynamic situation with career and family and so forth. But even though we have less time, we try. We try to, when there are gaps, to insert, or maybe we can even negotiate ourselves some time to be given that a slot of time where we can then dedicate ourselves to a greater understanding. Monastic training also offers training in critical thinking and understanding the right view. So like in monasteries, there's a lot of study, there is debate. And this is not about just learning Buddhist truths, but it's about understanding reality. Practitioners contemplate how they are handling the world and their experience. So it's not about just something that's limited to their particular world, but it's about understanding universal values and truths. They will clearly see their grasping and fixation and how this distorts reality. So that is the humble recognition that study facilitates. It's an understanding of the wrong view and also about what then to do with it. So our perceptions bring emotions and we get trapped. So this is the reality of us when we have this dualistic fixation, and on the basis of that we color our perceptions, we construct our world in particular ways that generate an attachment and aversions, and that's where we get trapped in this cycle. The Buddha, Traleg says, the point in Buddhism is that the mind has a tendency to automatically latch onto something and turn it into what it is not. Therein lies our samsaric downfall. When we have latched onto a person or an object, we superimpose our desires and expectations onto it. This arouses strong emotions and convictions in us through our belief that our perceptions is a strong reality. So this is where we again and again fall for our own projections. And most of us in the course of life experience, we realize the flawed nature of that. Therefore, Traleg says, right from the beginning, all practitioners, including ordained members of the Sangha, try to learn about that process. The practitioner tries to understand that about themselves, rather than focusing on the materiality of whatever the desirable object might be it a car, a house, or a sentient being. So we need to undertake this, regardless of whether we think of ourselves as just practitioners and not scholars, or if we think of ourselves as scholars or whatever, whether we think of ourselves as monastics or lay persons. As long as we don't address the samsaric mind and the cause of suffering, then we continue to fall for these myths and this poor understanding of reality. So we need to do something about it. We need to learn about the process that is involved when we begin to fixate. So what we're doing here is not about that there's something terrible out there in terms of things, and it's also not that we're terrible because of the way that we react. We are demonizing neither the object nor our responses. This is about understanding how the mind is disturbed. So it's about remedying our disturbed perceptions of the object. We can do that at any time. Yes, it's good to meditate if we can. Definitely we should. But also, we can, in the context of our lived experience, we can begin to be aware of and understand where it is our likes and dislikes, they sort of happen, how the wrong and right view can take place. And we can remedy then this situation. So it's not just about us recognizing our delusion, but also understanding our perception. So it's not about saying, oh gosh, I'm so stupid, I'm again and again falling for this. It's not about us judging ourselves in this way, but it's about us then being constructive and saying, okay, I perceive this in a particular way. Does it really exist in that way? And beginning to understand where it is that we can do something about this skewed this error that we continually perpetuate. So we understand that in this perception is really the place. This is the crux, that we're attributing some sort of value in these things. It's not enough to just sort of, in a way, it's a sort of a laziness to just whinge. Oh gosh, I'm so deluded. Yeah, that's a given. But we actually look at how we construct this perception that then catches us. And it's what catches us is this ensuing attraction or aversion, that leads to grasping and fixation. Again, it can be material things, it can be a sentient being as in another person and so forth, we can see what it is that's happening and where it is that we're actually projecting and believing in our projection. So Traleg Kyabgon says, a Buddhist monk or nun, through the practice of satipatthana meditation, uses mindfulness and awareness. They can begin to have some understanding of what is really going on in the mind. One develops an understanding that the mind is very selective, that the mind only chooses to settle itself on certain objects, and that the mind singles things out and then blows those things all out of proportion through its responsiveness. Our responses become all-consuming and can overwhelm the mind to the extent that potentially the mind becomes oblivious to everything else. This is what happens when we become obsessed. And the practice of mindfulness, satipatthana meditation, is what begins to extract ourselves from this. Now, meditation is important here, and this we talked about before, because that is what lubricates this process. Otherwise, we could just become moralistic. I shouldn't fall for that thing. I shouldn't exaggerate or obsess. Oh, I'm obsessing. Woe is I. But with the practice of meditation, we simply begin to work with the perception, and we're not so naively and gullibly carried away. So we should cultivate mindfulness. We should cultivate focus, but it's not about then condemning when we are there and mindful. We shouldn't start condemning what arises in the mind. Everything will arise, but it's about not following it. And we should also not developing contrived ways of handling our experience, saying, oh yeah, I'm not going to care about anything. I can't be bothered, Again, contrived. We need to be attentive and distinguish this attentive quality from grasping and fixation. We sustain this mindful quality, this aware quality. To be attentive is different from when our attention is being grabbed by the object. So being attentive is being alert, awake. And it's very different from when we're sort of, our attention is, try and notice, when our attention is completely sort of grabbed and we're lost in the object. That is where we lose control and we become slaves. And this is then why there's some benefit in the monastic approach. And the monastics, they will train in understanding what's going on. In meditation, we dispense with the fascination that fixates on the object. And again, this is where we're being proactive in not only ascertaining the, you could say, flawed nature of our perceptions, but actually also letting go of our habitual fascination with these kind of patterns of perception. Okay. So, correct understanding, the right view, is about reversing that tendency and seeing that what we think is unique, so unbelievably unique, is part of a pattern, part of an interconnecting field of factors and events, which will be discussed in more detail in part 2. It is important to recognize interdependence, or what is referred to as dependently arising. So we're going to be looking more at this, because this is where we begin to dismantle some assumptions about our reality. We're going to be looking at interdependence. We're also in the second part going to be looking at how the mind operates in terms of its then fixating. Okay. Today's reflections and commentaries are so helpful as reminders of the importance of our perceptions giving unfolding outer events. These outer events, they happen all the time. Right now, we're fixated on, we're attentive to some external events. It happens every time you build a house. You have to move the earth. Imagine how many animals down there are suffering on the basis of that. Suffering is happening all the time. So we're on the path definitely to address some of the very obvious sort of in our face problems, but we're also addressing the problems that we very often are oblivious to. And samsara is so extensive, we're oblivious to the enormous amount of suffering there is everywhere. So as a layperson, I feel that if we could utilize the time we spend by sleeping to practice the Dharma, we would advance on the path so quickly. Could you tell us if there is some emphasis on this in the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions? There is. If so, could you run a teaching about practicing while sleeping? I would wish I could, but I'm dreadful at that. I'm so unconscious when I sleep, occasionally once in a while. But there are persons who are really expert on this, and I would say ask them. So this is where you need some great yogis who could properly speak from experience. Of course, yes, there's a lot of teachings out there on how to do it, but I would say, as with many things, you need to have somebody who has experience and realization. Okay. All right. I've gone over time. Sorry, people. I hope that's okay. Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche did a teaching on dream yoga. Okay, that's great. So I would recommend that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your joining me here. Thank you. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom. So for next time, please read chapters 7 and 8, Interdependence and Where Samsara Resides.